we avoiding in our draft? That more this week on Audible Live. Audible Live, Matt Waldman. I think this might be the last time we do this without Cecil Lammey. Next Thursday, there's going to be a game. But before the games, there will be drafts, maybe a few drafts after the games, too. Who are you avoiding in your draft, Matt?
I think just at his price and at his risk level, just from his team, in terms of his offense, his quarterback, the changes around, Saquon Barkley. I got a chance to do a little bit of a project of scouting that I can't really go too much into, but I'll just say I had to do some scouting of Saquon Barkley again. And I was cross-checking another individual's work who did a really great report on him. And I really didn't have much of an argument with it, which is that he may not be as much of a lead back, foundational back as people make him out to be because of the great season he had. He's not a great decision maker. He's not someone who will run hard to try and break tackles. He tends to slip, not break tackles he should break. He's not as good in the open field as you would think he should be. And he should be better than all these things. But I think part of it is that kind of like Drew Lock, where Drew Lock has gotten away with not really working at the craft at the level he should have in certain areas. I think Saquon Barkley worked so much at the physical end of the craft that he hasn't really worked as much on the conceptual end as he should have. He's mega talented, but with everything going on, I don't think this regime is tied to Barkley. They obviously think they want to make him be the centerpiece of what's going on, but I just don't trust this offense. I want to see what happens in first year with Brian Dable before I really go in, and it's really more the price with players around him. I trust Alvin Kamara more, and he's a little higher. I'd rather have Aaron Jones or Nick Chubb as a fantasy analyst. I'm trying to remember his name. I think his last name's Kofler, who also drew the ire of J.K. Dobbins on Twitter because he basically showed a video of Dobbins performing a blocking drill, and he was pounding his feet. And he walked off and in a way that didn't look like symmetrical. So he said he's walking off with a big limp, got everybody freaked out about that even more. And he basically told the guy to shut the bleep up. But the thing is that, he made a really fun tweet that I liked. He said, anybody who says rate my team, anybody asks me to rate my team, always has somebody like Saquon Barkley on their roster. They never have Derrick Henry or Nick Chubb. Yeah. Nick Chubb or Aaron Jones or Javonte Williams, I would much rather have them at the same price than Saquon Barkley. Even if Barkley's upside is he could give you a Cooper Cup like season if everything comes together. But there, that's like saying, if Marcus Dupree didn't have the problems he had way back in the day, he would have been one of the greatest running backs who ever played. And that's true. But the floor was, the trap door was just too big for me.
Yeah, Barkley, he didn't quite make my all roll aids team, the players you were relieved to see go off the board before your pick because it makes your brain freeze whenever you have to decide whether to take them. But Barkley was right there. I actually had Derrick Henry and Najee Harris. I think all three, and they're all going around the same point in the draft. And just hope if you're at the end of the first round that you can get Cook or Mixon. I think those make you feel much more comfortable, those picks, than Barkley, Harris, or Henry. And maybe I'm a little too skittish about Henry, but it's just feelings. But let's go talk about Barkley a little bit more, because I think that you're putting the chip on Barkley. You're putting a chip on his talent. And like you said, I remember identifying this watching him at Penn State, Matt. He doesn't like contact. No. What do you do with a running back that doesn't like contact? And it's
interesting. Make him a wide receiver. Make him a wide receiver.
Right? And that's the thing, though. It's funny that you say that, because that's exactly what ties into, like, Saquon Barkley could not change one bit as a player, and the Giants' offense could change only. I mean, the Giants' offense can't be as bad as it was in the second half of the year last year. In the second half of the year last year, they looked like they weren't even trying. Like they were going to start punting on third down. But so it'll be incrementally better than that, but not a transformation. So let's say the offense doesn't lift him that much. Daniel Jones doesn't lift him that much. But if he just catches 80 balls, man, if he just catches 80 or 85 passes, he'll probably be a hit at ADP. That also implies that he stayed healthy. That's all. That's all it takes from a cold fantasy standpoint. If he catches 80 or 85 balls, he'll probably be a hit at ADP. Like you said, turn him into a wide receiver when there's a lot of signs coming out and saying I'm detached more from formation, moving around than I was since I was at Penn State. Again, fitting into the idea that what was holding Barkley back in addition to injuries was this coaching staff and how he was used. But at the same time, as you pointed out, and he's a player that isn't necessarily going to transcend this offense, because when he was a big fantasy hit, it was also with big plays. And this was a more viable offense than it was when he was a rookie, at least. So you spin yourself in circles talking about the ins and outs on these guys. You don't feel that way with a Joe Mixon. You don't feel that way with a Dalvin Cook. With Cook, it's more injury concerns. Just taking a step back, and let's talk about now. We'll touch on more players to avoid, situations to avoid, and maybe this will be one. I want to ask, because you spent a lot of time watching this player long before anybody cared about the name Dameon Pierce. Now with Marlon Mack on the practice squad, he was probably the most talked about player, Pierce, when we went through all the cutdown day news. If it costs a 5th round pick, a 6th round pick, maybe a slight discount from the excited, hot and bothered ADP level of Dameon Pierce, what would be your recommendation to everybody out there?
If you were going to have to take him at a 5th or 6th round pick?
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, you're looking at, to me, like, we talk a lot about Underdog, and they're a great unit and they're a great group. But if we're talking about home leagues, there's probably a little bit of a difference there. And because, so when you're talking in that range, you're looking at players like Tony Pollard, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Rashad Bateman, Amari Cooper, Juju Smith-Schuster. There's a lot of players who, Michael Thomas, maybe, if Michael Thomas is there, that's the guy as we talked about last week, I'm taking the risk with him. So, like, I would rather take the risk on Michael Thomas than the upside on somebody else. I might even rather take the risk on Adam Thielen at that point as well, or Darnell Mooney. Those guys seem to me like a little bit safer. Even Jerry Jeudy, I would feel pretty good about. But Dameon Pierce certainly is he's one of those backs that I think can be a starter in the league. He reminded me a little bit more of like a Tim Hightower type. Someone who's good enough that he could impress a coach to do the work needed to start, and he has all around skills. The only thing missing with him is game breaking speed. So that's the big question too, is, with the addition to their offensive line from the kid from North Carolina State, who's like, who's just like a moving brick wall. That should be helpful with his game. But I don't think unless I'm just looking at running back at that point, the best running back to me in that range is probably Josh Jacobs at 55. And I know everybody's thinking Zamir White, but I think that what happened there, Dillon and Jacobs are maybe there. If Dillon's there, I'd take Dillon. If Jacobs is, and with Jacobs there, I would probably go with Jacobs still, because while the offensive line wasn't wasn't great last year, doesn't forecast to be great this year. I think the alarms that were sounded after the Hall of Fame game had more to do with Josh McDaniels wanting to do, I think he actually meant what he said, as opposed to what, everyone overly reading into it. And so if you needed a back, I would probably go with those two. I would even consider Helaire, but I would say Pierce and Helaire would make me think a little bit harder on that. I would still opt for a receiver most likely than I would a back in this particular range. And I know I want to hear what you think about him as well, but I would his work in the passing game is probably the biggest appeal for me if they get rid of Burkhead from that range, because Burkhead, he's reliable with the route running. As a pass catcher and runner, I would take Pierce over Burkhead every time. But as a route runner, that might be the big question mark with him in terms of just being on the same page with his quarterback. But, to me, it's funny because, you asked me the question about what would be safe or what wouldn't be, and you mentioned him and Marlon Mack. And Marlon Mack, my thought the first time I saw that Marlon Mack got put on the practice squad, I said, well, that's one more anecdotal piece of evidence
Mm-hmm.
against running backs returning from Achilles tears with returning to being a starting level player. And that brought me to a player that I want to talk about after we talk about Pierce, which is Cam Akers, because I can't imagine wanting to
Yeah.
touch him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll close on Pierce like this. Like you said, the key variable here is if Pierce, who does have passing game chops, can have passing down work with Rex Burkhead there. And it might be more about, will Rex Burkhead stay healthy? Because as you said, Burkhead's just more polished, more refined, allows offensive coordinators, head coaches to sleep at night, especially with a young quarterback. Uh, knowing that he's going to be a regulating factor there with his experience in the backfield. Uh, and the other thing is, if the Texans are more competitive, and their offense is on schedule, then Pierce could potentially return value there. But I'm with you from a fantasy football standpoint. I'm looking at wide receivers there. I don't think AJ Dillon's going to be there anymore, but that's a slam dunk. Again, when you look at home leagues, AJ Dillon might be there. Um, Jacobs, I might differ from you, but the thing is, look, this is one of those wide range. There's going to be so much revision after week one. Yeah, there was a good back and forth on our base camp talk. Can't remember. Somebody sent back some feedback. We get all kinds of feedback, and I can't remember what it was. They said that our projections were clearly going to be wrong because of this, and I think it was our Jason Wood that said, "Well, if you make your rankings anywhere near the consensus, you're clearly going to be wrong because there's turnover. 50-60% turnover every year. So why just if you see rankings that look rational, they're probably wrong, right?"
Yeah, the reason I even started doing things like upside down drafting, or what people know as zero RB, was the whole idea is that once you think that you are safe with the consensus, with the convention,
Right.
you are at your most dangerous point.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, but that's the difficult thing, is that people want to differentiate. They say, I don't want any hot takes, I don't want hot take artists. And it's hard sometimes for people to differentiate someone who's done thorough, thoughtful analysis that differs from the norm versus
Right.
someone who's just saying, hey everybody, look at me, gotcha, thanks for showing me your eyes for
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah, and I mean it's America, so there's
Yeah.
roads to success or profit or endurance, lots of them, and that will persist. But you're right to point out. See, I like to hit the keynote, Matt, which I'm sure I have on the show many times already. This last month or so is the reason you want the thoughtful analysis. And I just did that debate show with Evan Silva, and it was fun because you want to familiarize yourself with the strongest case against your position on a player, so that if it starts to go that way, you'll be one of the first to notice it and know how to act.
Yep.
And you may even get the drop because you were so positive on a player to act correctly, whether the implication is trade the player, trade for another player, pick someone up off of waivers. You're going to be in on that first. So I just think with a player like Josh Jacobs, like I probably wouldn't recommend him just because I feel like whatever we see in week one from the backfield, there's such a wide range of outcomes that you're really getting into in Las Vegas terms, right? Like you're rolling the dice. Josh Jacobs might get 75% of the touches and everything's fine. Or Josh Jacobs might rotate series with Zamir White. And you feel like, oh boy, I don't even know what I have. And that it's just because of that uncertainty. But you brought up Cam Akers. And again, the bottom line there is, and I agree with you, Edwards-Helaire becomes interesting. Edwards-Helaire becomes interesting around that point in the draft too. If you feel like it's the 6th round, I have to take a running back. I'm looking at Pierce, Edwards-Helaire and Pierce. That's right about my break point, because I think they'll probably have similar roles to begin the season, but Edwards-Helaire is obviously in the better offense. You brought up Cam Akers. Let's talk about Cam Akers. I'll tee up Cam Akers for you. Okay, I think you're right to point out the Achilles. I don't think Dante Foreman completely counts as a win, although I mean, he's at least 90 or 95% of what he was. He's not 100% what he was in terms of his burst, but it's close enough that even if we don't call it a W, it's not an L. But otherwise, Justice Hill made the team. Okay, Justice Hill made the team. James Robinson, the Jags still intend for him to be a co-lead back. and we'll see. But even if teams have aspirations for these players coming back from Achilles tears, running back specifically, we still haven't seen a running back fulfill it. Then you get to Cam Akers. Now, we saw Cam Akers going into last season before the Achilles. We thought he's going to be a lead back. And we saw some inclination for them to treat him that way. Then he comes back from the Achilles surprisingly early, and he is the lead back. Okay, well, he's probably going to go into 2022 as the lead back, right? He's only going to be healthier, right? No, actually, it's a 1-1A situation in the way that they are dividing up the carries between him and Darrell Henderson. And in fact, Henderson is probably the healthier of the two. I was surprised the Rams didn't make a move at running back this week, to be honest. I thought when Sony Michel got released, maybe they would be back in on him, because it leads you, Matt, to at least, and I know this guy is really low on your list, but it leads you to Kyren Williams, who the team said they weren't going to play him in the last preseason game because he's going to have a big role in the offense. And look, I'm not a fan of Kyren Williams either, but if he's the healthiest running back, this offense will manufacture points for the running backs. It doesn't matter as long as they're as long as it's a comp. If Xavier Jones is re-signed, the starting running back is going to produce in this offense, assuming Matthew Stafford's out there. So I'm looking and thinking about, well, Kyren Williams, who put a line through when he broke his foot in the spring, now all of a sudden you're saying, well, if he has, especially if he has passing down skills to stay on the field, which is probably most of the reason they drafted him, right?
Right.
And then if Akers isn't right, if Henderson isn't right, well, all of a sudden Kyren Williams becomes maybe one of the waiver wire pickups of the year. But I think with Cam Akers, you're looking for something positive, anything to create momentum for this guy, and it's just not happening.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Jonathan Foreman and talked about him being at 95%, because I think that's the key thing, and it's probably one of the best things I would remember about anything that when you describe percentiles with talent. And I know that you're not being exact, but it's still a good thing to remember, because when someone says, well, he's 95% this, well, the difference between 95 and 99.99,
it could be
if
everything.
You're talking interactions, is like a freaking Grand Canyon worth of distance.
Well, if you allow me to interject, Matt, this is where your work in the RSP comes in, is that you draw a sketch of a player's game, so you understand if going from 100% to 95% could be a death knell for a player, because so much of their game, like Saquon Barkley, is predicated on their athleticism.
Yeah.
Versus maybe, if James Robinson is okay, maybe this isn't a validation for players that had Achilles tears. It's a validation for running backs whose game wasn't dependent strictly on their initial burst or strictly on their elusiveness. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, yeah. And here's the thing, though. I mean, and we'll get to him as well, but I mean, it's that, you listen to someone like Devontae Adams talk about it, and the difference between, 95% and 99, or 99 and 99.99, which is really the greatest are at, in terms of like success per interaction, is you're looking at that. And he said, when I came into training camp, or when I started to learn how to play the game, he goes, the athletes didn't scare me out of Fresno State coming here to Green Bay. He goes, I knew I was athletic enough. He goes, the biggest the hurdle of the game was really not making any mistakes, and processing solutions fast enough so that I didn't make mistakes, and doing it consistently. He goes, that's what took me a few years to figure out. And he said, and once I figured it out, he goes, what I learned was that when I study tape, I don't look at the defensive back and study his game and obsess over his game. It's just a number to me now. I don't care who it is. He's just a number, whether it's Xavier Howard or, Darius Slay. It's just a number. I'm looking at the coverage and understanding where the holes are in the coverage. And if they play man to man, I'm looking to see if they have any tendencies of whether they bump or do this. He goes, because it's all about me reading leverage and knowing my techniques and what solutions that I have and how fast I can process them. And when you look at, and that's that big difference. But when you start to knock down the physical skills that make you the difference between a starter and a guy who can make an NFL team, that's where the difference can be. And Cam Akers was not a great processor. So he's a decent one who could get better at it, but his game, like you said, predicated on speed, was more on speed and burst. Whereas with James Robinson, he had great short area change of direction and very good initial burst, that first 10 yards, where speed is more like 20 to 40 yards and maintaining it after 40 yards. And that's where Akers was strong. So, when you look at that particular thing with Akers, yeah, I think Kyren Williams is someone you want to look at in the late rounds because he's a late round player. And I think you make a great argument for that. The only thing that I would add for people is to understand that when you pick Kyren Williams in the late rounds or off your waiver wire, also understand that just like Baltimore last year with Tyson Williams, you can see that if Kyren Williams doesn't start off strong and doesn't look like he's ready to do what they want him to do in that role, they will find a free agent veteran back very quick or in a hurry, or they will be combing the waiver wire for a lot of backs who have shown that they can do certain things reasonably well. They may not be fantasy favorites like Royce Freeman or Trey Sermon or anybody like that, but they may be guys that they look at and go, we could probably get something out of him and do some decent work and get some decent work from him. Or he looks good in practice. We're gonna give him a shot over Kyren because it's not working with Kyren.
Yeah, it's what I've been talking about for a long time on this show, Matt. And it might be frustrating to us, but I think this is again where your RSP work is so indispensable. Coaches like dependability at running back. They like dependability more than running back more than flashiness. They like dependability at running back more than players who add value with extra tackle breaking ability and speed and things like that. Or more elusiveness. I think actually they love running backs who can break tackles to the point where it makes them, I think, overlook other things sometimes.
And same with high and speed, like those two things.
Right. But if a running back who they know is going to be solid in pass pro, who they know is going to have every aspect of the play call understood, who they know has the experience to react to changing information in front of them, maybe unexpected information, that's what makes coaches feel. That's why running back don't matter, right? That's why running backs are paid so little. That's why we're seeing running backs falling in the draft. We're seeing running backs, no first round running backs this year. Maybe that's about the class. But the point is the position's being devalued in a way because the skills that are necessary to make the offense go aren't the things that we are drawn to in fantasy football. And like you said, they'll be willing to pull the ripcord on a younger running back for a street free agent. And look, there's a surplus of talent that can play the position. There's a huge surplus. Look at the lack of a trade market for any number of guys. Trey Sermon, sorry, I had to say the name at least once, Matt. Zach Moss, okay. I told people to start Mike Boone in week 16, including myself. Anyway, and by the way, if you're not wrong in fantasy football, then you're not saying anything interesting anyway. But my point is that there are all these running backs. I think they were trying to, Alexander Madison, they were trying to drum up maybe Kareem Hunt. We have no idea. That just there's no market to trade for running backs because of
until there's desperation, and there's not any desperation
yet. Well, and this is one of those things that you can apply to fantasy leagues, right? Because I'm looking at my dynasty teams right now, Matt, and I'm itching to make some trades, right? I'm looking at my strengths and weaknesses. I'm looking at players I think might be a little overvalued, and the air is going to go out of their balloon once we watch them in week 1, week 2. But I realize that only after folks see their teams for a few weeks, see where the weaknesses are, see where the aspirations they have are not likely to be met, that's whenever you can make the trades. Not before the season when everybody's picturing their most optimistic case about everybody. And well, we'll see. But again, that comes back to that key fantasy football skill of adjusting before you have definitive proof that this is the new reality. I want to step through some different things that Cut Down Day News touched on, Matt. Baltimore running backs. Now we have J.K. Dobbins, uncertain for week 1. We have Kenyon Drake, who wasn't worth whatever couple million the Raiders are going to have to pay him. They like Amir Abdullah also, but was worth its contract. Because what was interesting to me about Drake, Matt, is that he was signed before week 1. I didn't even know if the league was speaking about the great abundance of running backs. And some people might say, well, this is about Gus Edwards. Well, they put Gus Edwards on the PUP list like a week ago. They knew Gus Edwards was going to be on the PUP list to start the season. Why wait? Maybe it's just Drake and what they think about Drake. Maybe it's a little more what they're learning about Dobbins. Maybe it's what they think about Mike Davis. They cut Tyler Beatty. They like, again, the older, veteran, dependable running backs. Is there anything to dabble in here? Is this something Ronnie Stanley hasn't been practicing? I think he just got cleared. Is there anything to even dabble in here? Because a couple of years ago, we were looking at the Baltimore running game, jackpot. There's a lot there. What's there now?
It's pretty overpriced right now, which is sad because if you take a gamble on J.K. Dobbins, it's a huge gamble right now. It could pay off massively because they do have an improved offensive line from last year, which is, offensive line was awful last year. That because of injuries. So if they're healthy and able to go, and Dobbins is healthy and able to go, then you may have a top 10 running back. That's how good it can be. But that's the big question because he's adamant that he's ready. And he seems like he's ready to fight anybody who's talking about him, which is kind of interesting in itself. He's a young guy. So he cares about what's going on. He's probably caring a little too much about what people think. And this is purely anecdotal, but whenever I've written anything about players, it's usually wide receivers when this has happened. But whenever I've written anything about players that was, that was constructive criticism about their game, whether it was Marquise Goodwin or Marquise Lee, they clapped back at me and were like, "You'll see." I'm still waiting to see.
Oh.
And I don't mean that as a thing against them, but I don't think that they're young, and I think they cared a little bit more. Even Calvin Ridley, I remember Calvin Ridley kind of clapping back at me. And, part of it is it's not that their games weren't good enough. There was a maturity factor there.
Yeah, why are you thinking about what Matt Waldman?
Yeah, who cares?
Right.
Worry about yourself.
Yeah.
Because there's fans saying worse things. There's fans saying like exponentially worse things about you than something that I would say based on tape that had nothing to do with you as a person, but your behavior, with a technique or a concept, and not making a sweeping conclusion of whether you're good or bad. But so the fact that players clap back like that, from that perspective, the ones who tend to like the tweet and it's a balanced reaction, those are the ones that I actually find seem to have a balanced understanding that they're trying to improve their games. The ones who say, "I'm going to show you," and say something more like defensive are the ones that you're like exactly the way that you're putting it. So, from this end of the this end of the spectrum, I would say, it's a huge gamble. Drake is established as a pass catcher, and he can run gap plays. When he got drafted, and I know that we did our show, and I was like, wow, they drafted a back who I just don't think was ever going to be a star in this league to draft him that high. He's all athlete without any kind of like concept of what to do. And I still show people like the tape of him literally like running his head into the backside of his blocker and doing this multiple times and getting knocked out on his feet, and not for the joy of that, because obviously you don't want to see anybody get concussed. But the thing is that he's still a guy that if you give him like, hey, here's the hole, don't have to manipulate much. You don't have to worry about anything other than just run as fast as you can straight through it. A Kyle Shanahan back. If you can do that, that's great. And the Ravens run a lot of gap schemes.
Yeah.
And with Lamar, you can do that. So he can catch, he can run, he's got the speed. I think they're looking at that and saying, Tyler Beatty wasn't good enough for us. And I understood that one. That made sense to me. The idea of Mike Davis just not having enough juice, probably part of that. He's an older guy, he can catch, but we need somebody. They want a speed element in that backfield, and they probably felt like he's just at the right age. He has just the right amount of experience. He could fit for us and be good if J.K. Dobbins isn't ready soon enough.
And Dobbins is a player that, like you said, the indicators he's been giving off that he's so combative about what's typical in the NFL when you're coming back from injury. There's going to be a lot of scrutiny. I mean, hopefully it's not that he's frustrated with how it's going, because he did have a multiple ligament tear And with both he and Gus Edwards, makes you wonder because both of them tore their ACL before the season, and we've been seeing less than a year as a pretty standard. Now, again, Dobbins would have a simple ACL tear. We'll see. But I think it's best to probably stay away from this backfield.
It's a shame too because he's a
he was
fantastic
perfect.
talent. I had him slightly above Jonathan Taylor pre-draft. That's
Yeah.
how much I liked him, and I loved Taylor. So I'm rooting for him so much, but I just don't. This year I'm out on him at his price. It's just too high.
And even the Ravens offense, I'm not totally back in on yet. I mean, like you said, offensive line was part of it, but I still just wonder. Like I've said this a couple of times this summer, I've been watching so much baseball, and I think about things in terms of the pitcher hitter mental confrontation, and I think that's kind of the play callers on both sides of the ball, the defense and the offense. There's a similarity there, and I just think people know what pitches are coming from Greg Roman. And Lamar Jackson can still go into a burning building if he has to, but I just don't think that the Ravens give a lot of advantage to their offense through their play designs, play calls, play sequencing.
They don't, and I think that part of it is that they feel they have that mano a mano thing where they feel like, well, we're Nolan Ryan or
Right.
Roger Clemens. Lamar Jackson makes us that. So
Right.
go ahead and see if you're like, yeah, I know when they're going to throw the curve. Okay, fine.
Right.
It's good enough, but it's not great. But that fastball, yeah, good luck with that, especially on a good day.
And then you see in the playoffs that teams clobber them because of that predictability. I want to touch on some more cut down day stuff. Oh, actually, before I get off of that Ravens tip about not having great confidence, I want to run a couple of things past you. We've got like 15 minutes left. Just want to quickly get your reactions because about 5 more things after that from cut down day I want to get your opinion on. Okay.
Sure.
I saw a bunch of stuff about the Cowboys in the last few days that the Cowboys writers are finally just come out and saying they're not trying to win. They're really just setting up Mike McCarthy as a patsy so they can do whatever they want to do. And other Cowboys writers after those takes got out there said, yep, exactly what I've been thinking since March. Right. Does that affect how you see anybody in this Cowboys offense?
No. Because
you believe it.
I know. I mean, I know that we talk up beat writers a lot here, and they have value. They really do. They report information. They oftentimes hit upon good questions and report that information well. They are here to be storytellers. Most of them don't watch enough football to be great at football analysis. That's not their job. Some of them, the stories that are the questions they asked are driven to them by people who are asking for eyeballs. So while they could be right, I just the more I talk to people who who've done some work in the league or do work in the league, and the more stories I hear about, some of them national beat writers who just look so pleased by the fact they're getting walked around by the GM that you'd think that they're like they met Elvis or the Beatles or something, and some of them are that old. And that the things that assuage them aren't really about the game. There's a lot of younger guys who are really more about the game, and I really love that. I think Cecil's about the game, but there's some of that, like, I'm holding coattails type of mentality, and I'm just there on the scene, and that's so exciting, and they get high off of that it's easy to just kind of, and they're just reporting things. And when you go back and listen to stories, whether it's true crime or whether it's something else, they always have the reporters on. Some of the reporters you see, it's like the thrill is about the story more than it is about the actual situation, that they even forget to have their humanity, they lose some of their humanity with it. So the story from this angle, I don't know. I've just seen too many things where I hear that, and it's a little too conspiratorial for me. And at the same time, Mike McCarthy has more, maybe from a personnel decision standpoint of who they're going to pick up and who they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry Jones and the GMs have more control over
He
that.
said, "I'll defer." He said
Yeah.
when they were asking about left tackle, because Jerry Jones came out and says Tyler Smith, who, if you were watching our live broadcast, was it Mark Schofield who gave the report on him? Who was it that was on with us and said, well, or is it John Owning maybe? I don't remember who was on.
Yeah.
We had somebody on that was like, yeah, of course the Cowboys were going to take him. He's got all the traits, but boy, does he need to be coached up. And here comes Jerry Jones saying he's going to get safe to say he's the left tackle. And then they asked Mike McCarthy, he says, I'll defer.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And it is, but that's the thing. It's like they may have more control over personnel, which make things a bit difficult. But in terms of game planning, play calling, the players out on the field, they still have more opportunity to impact. It's kind of like Major League, the old movie about the Cleveland baseball franchise, where you have the I don't remember, they're called the Guardians now.
Yeah,
so,
the Ians. Just they had to get something to keep the Ians in there.
So they did the that's the thing, is that management can impact that, but if you still have enough good players to affect the outcome.
You're right.
So
are they
going to be?
That's a good point.
So that's the thing where I look at it, is that there's still good enough players, and really, if it means they just gonna have to throw the ball more, well, then it just means that Dak Prescott's still not worth where he's being drafted, and he's not a player I'm picking up either. And that's another player that I would add to that list. I would still take CD Lamb, because I think he's going to get enough volume. He could be a Jarvis Landry plus type in terms of the amount of volume that he's going to get. I don't think I'm taking any other receiver unless it's just extremely cheap, like Jalen Tolbert gets cut after the whole rookie excitement happens, and then he comes back and starts to play well. You can pick him up off the waiver wire later. Your tight end of choice, once they disappoint and get cut, you might be able to get them. And, maybe one of the running backs, at this point, I was really high on Elliott. I really thought that would be work. But once Tyron Smith got hurt, now I'm kind of like, he falls just enough to that point where it's like he's no longer a value, relative to what people thought. And then that upside still may be an issue, even though maybe the replacement that they get can be a better run blocker than pass protector, and it still may be helpful. Or still be like not as much of a net negative as people would expect. Still, that's my whole thing about it. It's just,
and here's what I'll say too. And again, it's all about keeping your brain flexible, right? So they face the Bucks week 1, and they face week 2 the Bengals. So we could easily see them coming off back-to-back blowout losses. And at the very least, you should be able to get data out of those games of who would, if anybody, benefit from the Cowboys being a miserable team. Like you said, maybe they pass more. Maybe it's a lot more comeback scripts with CD Lamb. Maybe that puts Tony Pollard on the field more. And at the very least, if you're lowering your expectations for this team, think of it in terms of Vegas win totals. Like if you're now betting the under, or like I was telling folks, rush and before the odds catch up and bet on the Eagles to win the division. I mean, there's some betting stuff here, but for fantasy, you're going to get a simulation, not a simulation, actual data. I'm sorry. Of, well, if this team is a team that's going to be trailing, what's the offense going to look like? Who's going to be the focus? How's Dak Prescott going to adjust, and so on. And then they play the Giants in Washington, so maybe it'll be okay. But then they have some tough games after that. The Rams, Eagles. Go ahead.
You might win your league this year. This is the kind of way out there things that happen. The Dallas will be the type of team that you end up picking a player off the waiver wire to win your league in the late weeks. It'll be a player like Rico Dowdle.
He made Carolina.
The team. Yeah, he's been on the team for the past 3-4 years now, and he's fended off a lot of people that they've tried to bring in over him as a running back. He can pass and he can catch and he can run pretty well. He breaks a lot of tackles, and he's quick and agile. So if somehow Ezekiel Elliott is just like something happens, he throws a tantrum, he and Jarrah have a meltdown, whatever, gets hurt. I'm sorry, but Pollard is a great space player. He's still unproven as a between the tackles runner. He's kind of like, he's a little more like, we wanted to make Antonio Gibson a thing, so we're also gonna make his running mate Tony Pollard a thing too. And Pollard may turn into that thing, because I thought Gibson could. But if he doesn't, Rico Dowdle might be that sneaky player that you go, who was him and how did you win win that league
Oh,
with
yeah.
that guy. That's
There's
who
been
that guy could be.
more obscure names in August, September that win in December. Okay, so this is like a lightning round. I'm
Let's
headed over
do
to
it.
the Discord server. Check out the Football Guys. The Football Guys Twitter account will have a link. Here in about 10 minutes, I'm going to be answering questions over on the Discord server. That's right, we got a Discord server. Eric Stoner and others who've been clamoring for this. So just like 50 words or less kind of answers. And I know that's as hard for me as it is for you, but I want to touch on these stories while they're still fresh. Okay. Greg Dulcich on IR. How excited, how willing should we be to take Albert O before anybody else?
Liked him before, liked him during he's not playing enough. He's playing later in games. Great receiver. Russell Wilson's, one of Russell Wilson's favorites. Still a value.
Philip Lindsay, Tyson Williams released. Is Nyheim Hines really the backup to Jonathan Taylor?
No, Deion Jackson is. Nyheim Hines is the scat back du jour who will get the number 2 role in terms of production. But if Jonathan Taylor gets hurt, they're getting a veteran, and they're going to give Deion Jackson a try, who's a speedster out of Duke, who can run gap plays very well and has shown up pretty well as a receiver too. And the fact that he made it over those 2 guys, you need to pay attention to Deion Jackson as a potential late round or as a waiver wire pickup.
Yeah, that stood out to me. You know what else stood out to me real quick? Avery Williams made the Falcons roster as a running back.
Yeah, they as a former cornerback.
Yeah.
So that tells
Tony
you
Hollings, wasn't that guy back in the day who was the supplemental draft pick for the Texans who switched from corner to running back?
Yeah, he's one of those. And Robert Edwards, before he got drafted as a running back, but he was a cornerback at Georgia, and they had too many injuries, and they needed somebody to put into their field, and they're like, oh my God, what do we have here?
Okay, if you were in on Trey Lance, should you be worried about Jimmy Garoppolo staying in San Fran?
No, not really. But at the same time, if you don't trust it, it's hard to figure out what's going on with them. Are they, do they like a player? Do they not like a player? Again, Kyle Shanahan's the Meryl Streep and Devil Wears Prada for coaches.
Inscrutable. Logan Woodside is no longer the number 2 for Tennessee. It's Malik Willis. What do you think we're going to see if we see Malik Willis before the end of the season, start a few games?
Lots of highs and lows. You're going to see big play passes, huge runs that look like Michael Vick. He's like a slightly rawer version of raw Michael Vick. So it's going to be unbelievably exciting. I'll put it that way.
One of my favorite clips from Cutdown Day this year, and it's another good moment to remind folks. I also want to say the couch hasn't come out yet. I was on with Alan Soslowski, and I took a moment out to remember Stephen White. It's just really sad to hear. He was a great member of our community, great football player, a great addition to the conversation, and someone that we all love to listen to because of how enthusiastic, but also well-founded and experienced all of his stuff was. And Cutdown Day's human drama. It's a big human drama. For some of these guys, it's like the culmination of their life, and that means it's a culmination of probably any number of people, dozens of people that have been fully invested with them on this journey. Jaylen Warren had my favorite clip from Cutdown Day, Matt. He was talking about how people were congratulating him at 3:55. He's like, no, he was like hiding in the corner until 4:01. He's like, I'm not going to feel okay until 4:01. And then he was ready for the congratulations. Should folks congratulate themselves if they take him late? Is there something there behind Najee Harris?
I still think they'll be looking for a free agent addition. But he certainly has enough burst to be in the NFL. He has good movement skills, good. He can catch the ball. He's kind of like 85% Maurice Jones-Drew. But again, the Steelers also liked Anthony McFarland and Benny Snell. And so it's kind of like if he's better than those 2 guys, then he may have a fighting chance to contribute a little bit more. But I still think they're going to be looking for someone else. And I would say Trey Sermon would be a good fit there as the type of back that he is. I think that he'd be a good fit for that particular offense. So we'll see.
Yeah. Faint praise when you're better than Benny Snell, Anthony McFarland. 4th round picks. When you take a running back in the 4th round, we are happy that we're on your draft board anywhere. Hopefully we're your 1st round pick when it comes to podcasts and advice. Again, head on over to the Discord server, check the Football Guys Twitter for the details. I'll retweet it. I retweeted it already. I'm going to come over there. So if you got questions, things we didn't touch on, as always, we appreciate your support because you're the classiest.